Okay, let me, before I get into the other president that we're going to be talking about today, I'd like to talk just a little bit more about Jefferson in particular and the founding guys in general. You'll notice I'm not calling them the Founding Fathers. That's the Warren Burger term. I think of it as the Warren Burger term, although in writing my more recent book, The Founding Fathers Reconsidered, I discovered something I didn't know, and I'll bet you guys don't know this either. Who coined the phrase Founding Fathers? Would anyone care to take a guess? I'll give you a hint. It does not come into existence until nearly a century after they're dead. Someone said Charles Beard, and that's the right time frame. Warren Gamaliel Harding. Warren Harding coined the phrase in his keynote speech, the Republican National Convention in 1916, kept using it until he finally puts it into effect for good in his inaugural address in 1921. I don't like the phrase. It's too reverent. It's too worshipful. It's too uncritical. I mean, we have to, what I say in my book is, instead of gazing reverently up at the founding guys or looking down our noses at them, we ought to meet them eye to eye. Because they were human, as we are. And they had human strengths and human frailties, as we do. They were able sometimes to transcend their era, but they were also prisoners of their era, as we are. And so, when I hear people like a certain modern political movement, and I don't want to get political on you, I am saying this only as a scholar and historian, when I hear people saying, we are true to the ideals and vision of the Founding Fathers, I say, no, you're not. You don't have a freaking clue. You don't get these guys. They didn't all agree on anything. The founding guys argued with one another constantly. What we have is not a product of their let us join hands together because we all agree. No, they almost never had a moment like that. It was usually, let us compose our differences. Let us, as Ben Franklin said at the end of the Federal Convention, let us doubt a little of our own infallibility. Let us compromise. Compromise. The founding guys compromised regularly. Sometimes the compromises were great and made a great deal of sense, like the creation of Congress. One house represents the people and is apportioned by population. The other house represents the states, and each state has an equal voice, 2 votes. That's a good, sensible compromise. Are there compromises like the compromises over slavery? Are classic examples of political hostage-taking. We will break up this convention unless you agree to certain protections for our peculiar institution. Bad compromise. That could never happen again, now could it? Gee, maybe it did. Be that as it may, they're human like us. To set them up as some timeless standard of political wisdom is not only kind of silly, it goes against what they themselves expected. They expected us to move beyond them. They expected us to make advances on their knowledge. We hear it from Jefferson. We hear it from John Adams. We hear it from James Madison. We hear it from all the founding guys. They engaged in a creative argument between past and present about the future. They expected us to do the same. I think sometimes when you hear politicians, left or right, say, we are being true to the founding guys and you should back us because we're being true to the founding guys, without kind of referencing the inherent political wisdom of what they're saying, they're selling you a bill of goods. Another problem. The founding guys did not have a clue about what society was going to be like 2 centuries and more after they were here. They could not imagine a Supreme Court with 3 female members and 1 African American member. They could not imagine a black president. They could not imagine a Supreme Court, by the way, with 6 Catholics and 3 Jews. Shalom, shalom. And no Protestants. This is extraordinary. They could not imagine Asian Americans in Congress. They could not imagine any of this stuff. Just one further example before I move on. The question I've gotten many times, what would the founding guys have made of September 11th? My response is they would have had a collective nervous breakdown. First of all, New York, 8 million people, when the United States in 1790 was 3.5 million? Holy crap. Second, you show them a picture of the World Trade Center, 110 stories tall. I'm trying to find it. I found a letter once where Adams describes when he's in Paris, John Adams, going up to the top of a building 6 stories tall, looking down and getting a violent headache. Jefferson talks about climbing onto the Natural Bridge and looking down 270 feet and getting a violent headache. That's in Notes on Virginia. You can find that easily. Jefferson is the great architect among them, who said, how do you make a building that tall stand up? He had no idea what reinforced steel interior construction was. Then you show him airplanes. Oh yeah, we knew you'd get flying machines. But then you tell him, look at this picture of an airplane. The fuel tanks of this airplane have more destructive power than the entire Royal Army and Navy combined. They go nuts again. Then you show them the video, that horrible day. And this is what really sends them to Bellevue. I'm serious. The whole world saw it happen in real time as it happened. Whether you lived in Charlottesville or Braintree or London or Paris or Riyadh or Jerusalem or Melbourne or Sydney or Tokyo or Beijing or Nairobi, wherever you were seeing it as it happened. These men were used to having to wait months for news from across the Atlantic. Maybe 6 months to a year from news from the other side of the world. Even a week to 10 days for news, if they were in Charlottesville, news from Boston. They wouldn't begin to comprehend the world of September 11th, let alone the event. And one last example. How many of you used to watch Star Trek? I love Star Trek. Okay, what is your opinion of the Vulcan-Rigel War of 2295? You have no idea, do you? Because you have no idea that there are civilizations on Vulcan or Rigel, let alone that they're going to go to war in 2295. To ask you that question is as stupid as asking what the founding guys would make of September 11th. It's stupid. It makes no sense. But as we are learning to our cost, the American political system's capacity to generate stupid questions seems to be without limit. Now let's turn instead to a really, really intelligent yet incredibly flawed president. I asked before how many of you, and a surprisingly large number, reassuringly large for me, said, yes, I remember Richard Nixon when he was president. The theme of what I want to talk about with you guys today is this. Richard Nixon's presidency was a unique ordeal, a constitutional ordeal for himself and for the nation. He and his administration repeatedly collided with the Constitution over and over again on issues like presidential war powers, freedom versus secrecy, separation of powers, checks and balances, criminal justice. and issues I can't really get to today: pornography, civil rights, and of course the agonizing issue of abortion. Roe v. Wade was decided during his presidency, and the main opinion for the court in Roe v. Wade was written by an appointee of his, Justice Harry Blackmun. Nixon brought to boiling point a cauldron of constitutional problems that afflicted the American system then and are still troubling to this day. Now, why? We have a vague sense of Nixon, unless we're specialists in this period, or specialists in the history of the Constitution. Why is that? Because a lot of the time we make the mistake of thinking that the issues are peculiar to his presidency and peculiar to him. And let's face it, with respect to the dead, he was a peculiar guy. He was extraordinarily uncomfortable in conventional small talk settings. He's the kind of guy who would walk on the beach wearing a jacket and tie and ordinary classic shoes, not sneakers or whatever. I mean, Nixon, someone once said Nixon looked as if he was born at the age of 42. He's a peculiar man. He's endlessly fascinating. I think, in some ways, he is Shakespearean. Somewhere, the ghost of William Shakespeare is just eating his metaphorical liver, saying, I never got to write about him. I never got to write about him. Peter Morgan, our Shakespeare, who does amazing historical movies, like Frost Nixon, captured Nixon brilliantly, with the help of a truly great actor, Frank Langella. Now, you remember Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford, who we have habitually and unfairly underrated. I think in retrospect, Ford's star is going to rise like you wouldn't believe, that he really was a remarkable president. But you remember his first speech as president. My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Footnote, that last phrase is from the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights, drafted in part by John Adams. Have to plug John Adams. Ford was acknowledging that under Nixon, the system had not worked, triggering a long national nightmare. And he suggested that Nixon's departure ended that nightmare, restoring the constitutional system to working order. Ford meant well, and I think in many ways, as president, he really tried to restore the constitutional system to working order. But what he took as a conclusion, I think, remains an open question, because later controversies over presidential power and presidential misconduct suggest that the issues we saw dramatized in Nixon's era are still with us. They were not resolved by Watergate. But the American people have treated the Nixon era as they would treat any other, to use Ford's word, nightmare. Or the late great journalist J. Anthony Lucas, who wrote a great book on the underside of the Nixon years called Nightmare. Most people regard nightmares as unreal, traumatic experiences that are best forgotten. And that's how many Americans have treated Nixon and Watergate. I think the lessons that we should have learned and should still learn are in danger of dissolving into limbo. The leading example is the imperial presidency. You remember, that's a bad term. A presidency that is reaching past its constitutional bounds for powers it should not have. Okay, it was controversial during Nixon's era. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote the book, The Imperial Presidency, and right after Nixon's era. But it has faded from view. We now hear about the unitary chief executive. Has anyone heard this phrase here? The unitary chief executive. It's a theory of presidential power advanced by such people as former Vice President Dick Cheney and the law professor John Yoo, who used to serve in Bush II's White House and Justice Department. And it traces its arguments to one sentence, the first sentence of Article 2, Section 1. The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States. Now, Article 1 says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. Cheney, Yoo, and their allies argue that sentence, the executive power shall be vested, means that the president gets a whole bunch of executive power. Everything that George III had at the height of his powers, everything. He can make war. He can make peace. They dismiss all the contrary evidence from the Constitution's origins. Further, they pass over the dire consequences that such a presidency could have for the constitutional system. Watergate made those consequences evident. And some of you may remember, whether from the movie Frost-Nixon or from the actual David Frost interviews with Nixon in '77, the key one on Watergate, the last one, when Frost says, but this happened, this illegal thing happened, and this illegal thing happened. And Nixon says, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. Just saying it, my blood runs cold. Just saying it, hearing it. Nixon's presidency is an unnerving illustration of the cliched truth, and we all know that cliches start as truths, that we should not forget the past lest we be condemned to repeat it. And it sheds a bleak light also on uncritical veneration of the presidency by citizens, politicians, and scholars, which occurred for decades preceding Nixon's election. So let's begin by looking at who Nixon was. Before the presidency, okay, he was born in Whittier, California on January 9th, 1913. Be alerted. In about 18 months, we are going to endure the Richard Nixon centennial, his 100th birthday, which is really kind of staggering. He was one of 4 children of Frank Nixon and Hannah Milhouse Nixon. He grew up in a family beset by economic hardship and illness. 2 of his brothers died young, leaving him with a burden of survivor guilt. He had, I think, an abusive father and a mother, as you remember, people won't write books about my mother, but my mother was a saint. Remember that? I mean, from his last speech as president, his mother put a terrible burden on him of expectation and achievement. He was keenly intelligent. Never underestimate Nixon's intelligence. The man was probably one of the smartest men ever elected to that office. And he was absolutely determined to succeed. His law school classmates called it his iron butt, as in tuchus. Yeah, both the sheer intellectual brain power and the willingness to sit and study hour after hour after hour after hour. He was a workaholic. He just wouldn't stop. But he was always convinced that as the guy he was, coming from the origins he did, he would always face overwhelming odds and unfair obstacles to his success. He was graduated from Whittier College at the top of his class, and Duke University Law School, 3rd in his class. Really extraordinary. He made abortive forays into business and law enforcement. He tried to become an FBI agent. It turned out that budget cuts prevented him from being taken on. That's another example of the world changing because of something you can't. Richard Nixon could simply have been an FBI agent. Who the heck knows how the world would have been? He went ultimately into private law practice, and he was very proud to point out that he was the only modern president to have worked his way up from being your classic run-of-the-mill private lawyer. In 1940, he married Thelma Ryan. We know her as Pat Nixon. And they had 2 daughters, as you know, Julie and Tricia. In 1942, he took a government job. He was a staff attorney in the Office of Price Administration, and then he enlisted in the U.S. Navy for 2 reasons. 1, he wanted to serve his country, and 2, he knew after the war, to have a political future, you'd better have served. He graduated from Officers Candidate School, and most of what he did as a naval officer had to do with the law. They knew they had a lawyer on their hands. They figured they might as well use him as a lawyer. He served in the supply route in the Pacific Campaign. He didn't actually see combat. Played lots and lots of poker for money. He earned the capital to found his post-war career at the poker table. He apparently was a great poker player. He left the Navy in 46 as lieutenant commander with 2 service stars and several commendations. And then in 46, a committee of Republican businessmen in Whittier were looking for a candidate to run against the Democratic incumbent. Most people figured that Jerry Voorhis was unassailable. He had been voted the best congressman west of the Mississippi more than once. He'd been voted maybe the best young congressman in the House. But Nixon ran against him, stressing his war record and stressing his opposition to communism and the idea that Jerry Voorhis was soft on communism. This was 4 years before Joe McCarthy noticed that there was an issue of communism. He beat Voorhis by 15,000 votes, which was a landslide. Now, in political history, the class of 1946 in Congress, House and Senate, that's the first post-war Congress. It's the launch point for a whole generation of political leadership. And the 2 key people in that class were 2 young freshman representatives, Richard M. Nixon of California and John Fitzgerald Kennedy of Massachusetts. They knew each other, they liked each other, but Nixon always saw Kennedy as a handsome, wealthy dilettante with an elite background, whereas Nixon saw himself as having had to fight for everything he achieved. Toward the end of his first term in the House, Nixon found an issue. He had joined the House Un-American Activities Committee. Most people regarded HUAC in that period as a collection of idiots. Even though they could cause trouble and humiliate people, most Americans looked at HUAC as kind of a sideshow. Nixon saw its possibilities. A man named Whittaker Chambers, who was an editor and reporter for Time magazine, came before the committee to bare his soul. Now, Chambers would bare his soul to a fire hydrant if it was around. Chambers was this weird, neurotic, soul-bearing kind of guy. He had to atone and beat his breast and, oh my God, I'm a terrible person. I was a communist. And I knew Alger Hiss, and he was a communist too, and he gave me documents to send to Russia. Now, who was Alger Hiss? He was an aide in the New Deal. He was an aide to Franklin Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference in 45. And he was now head of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And if his career had gone undisturbed, in a future Democratic administration, he might have become Secretary of State. But Whittaker Chambers named him as a communist. Now, there were people like Truman's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, and leading Wall Street Republicans like John Foster Dulles, who was later Eisenhower's Secretary of State, who said, oh, no, Hiss is clean, you shouldn't listen, it's awful. But Nixon suspected something, because Nixon was a lawyer, and he heard Hiss. Hiss came before Congress to clear his name, and he said, I don't know anybody named Whittaker Chambers. And Nixon said, that's curious. He didn't say, I don't know Whittaker Chambers. I don't know anybody by that name. Remember, Nixon was a really sharp, shrewd lawyer. He realized that that was a lawyerly way of putting things, because Hiss was also a lawyer. Nixon dug into the case, met with Chambers constantly, and through his shrewdness, his determination, and his iron butt, Nixon was able to make the charges against Hiss stick. Hiss was never prosecuted for being a communist or for espionage. He was prosecuted for perjury, for lying to the committee. But that made Nixon's bones, as they say in the mafia. He got somebody. And again, this is years before Joe McCarthy gets into the commie game. Nixon made anti-communism the core of his political career. Now, people later linked him with Joe McCarthy, but as one of his advisors put it, McCarthy used a shotgun, but Nixon used a rifle. Nixon would make very few charges, but he would always be sure to make them stick. Gary Wills once said that people compared Nixon going up against Hiss to a poker game. In that poker game, Nixon had cards up and down his wrists and in his back pocket. It was a stacked deck. Nixon won re-election in 48. In 1950, he ran for the Senate against a Democratic incumbent named Helen Gahagan Douglas, his campaign called her the Pink Lady, pink being a shade slightly less than red. She was soft on communism. And Nixon developed this way of campaigning. He'd make a charge, he'd wait for the person to counter in a lawyerly way against the charge, and then he would be the wounded innocent. And it worked over and over and over again. One of his mentors in this was a guy named Murray Chotiner. And Murray Chotiner said, the most specific thing you should say about your candidate, hooray for John Smith. What do you say about the other candidate? What about the parking meter racket? Now, the candidate can deny until the cows come home that there is no parking meter racket, but he's denying it, which means there may be something to hide, and he looks bad. Those of you who remember that Nixon would occasionally say, I am not going to say that my opponent said or did X, immediately planting in your mind, oh, but his opponent said or did X. He's being good at not bringing it up, but there's something to think about. He was very good at this. Charges of dishonesty tainted Nixon's image. The classic question was, would you buy a used car from this man? 1952. Nixon goes to the Republican National Convention. He's the junior senator from California. He's a rising star in the party. The California delegation to that convention was backing their favorite son candidate, the governor of California, a man named Earl Warren. That name may ring bells. The two leading candidates for the nomination were former General Dwight Eisenhower and Senator Robert Taft. Eisenhower is the candidate of the Eastern liberal Republican elite, which is now officially extinct. Taft was the candidate of the Republican right wing, which these days is the nearly extinct moderate Republican Party. Our political system has shifted significantly rightward in 2 generations. Nixon was approached by Eisenhower operatives, and he said, I'm going to detach the California delegation from Warren and feed them over to Eisenhower so he can capture the nomination. Good, then we'll make you his running mate. Great. And what are we going to do for Warren? Well, we'll give him something. He's a lawyer. He might want to be a Supreme Court justice someday. That's exactly what happened. It was a complex set of deals. That's how Nixon ends up on the ticket. He's young. He's 39. Ike is 62. He's a war veteran. Ike is the great heroic general. And he is an anti-communist. Cleaner than Joe McCarthy. That fall, unfortunately for Nixon, charges surfaced that his supporters were putting together a slush fund to supplement his salary. Now, whatever funds they put together was actually legal and not really dirty. It just didn't look good. But the scandal built, and Eisenhower ultimately decided that he thought Nixon should leave the ticket. Instead, Nixon made a live televised speech to the country, which you can find on YouTube, and you should all watch it. This is the notorious Checkers speech. Nixon, to prove that he was clean, itemized all his finances for the audience. His wife, Pat, is sitting in a chair looking adoringly at him as he's making this speech. It's an extraordinary speech. It's humiliating for him. You feel for the guy as he's doing it. But then he starts saying, well, I think all the candidates in this race should do what I have done. I suggest that all the candidates, and the surface meaning is that Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee, should do this. Because Stevenson apparently had a slush fund in his past of questionable legality. But the other thing was Eisenhower. The IRS had given Eisenhower a sweetheart deal on the royalties from his World War II memoirs. He didn't want that made public. If Nixon got his way, Eisenhower would have to make that public. Why is Nixon doing this? Because Eisenhower's trying to force him off the ticket. He seems like an embarrassment. Eisenhower at one point says, we all have to be as clean as a hound's tooth, which may be why Nixon brought up Checkers. You want to know where Checkers comes in? Well, I shouldn't bring this up, but since they'll probably use it against me, I might as well. And it turned out that some reporter had interviewed his kids, and they said, we want a dog. All kids want a dog. And when they got home to California, there was a package waiting for them at the station, and there was a Cocker Spaniel. And my daughter, Tricia, named it Checkers. And the kids love that dog. And we're not going to give it up, no matter what anybody says. No one was asking Nixon to give up the dog. But what Nixon was saying was, these people are so against me, they might even ask me to give up my kid's dog to prove how clean I am, and that's crazy. It was a brilliant speech. Eisenhower had expected Nixon at the end of the speech to quit. But instead, Nixon basically said to the audience, tell me what you want me to do. Send your telegrams and your letters to the Republican National Committee, not Eisenhower. A tidal wave, 2 million telegrams and letters, 96% of them saying to Nixon, stay on the ticket. Eisenhower was outmaneuvered, outflanked over and over and over again in this speech. It was brilliant politics by Nixon, but Eisenhower never forgave him. The two men were not close. So what happens? They get elected president. The problem is Eisenhower has health problems. Ike is very sick. I can tell you a story that I heard from one of my mentors, Richard B. Morris, the great historian at Columbia. Morris had just joined the Columbia faculty in 46, 47. He was crossing Amsterdam Avenue. He wasn't looking where he was going. And suddenly he felt this vice-like hand grab him by the right arm and yank him back, just as an 18-wheeler passed through the space where Morris was about to step. And this tall man bellowed at Richard B. Morris, "Are you crazy? I have a heart condition. You could have given me a heart attack." The tall man was the president of Columbia, Dwight Eisenhower. Morris knew that Eisenhower had a heart condition. And he figured, I could destroy his chances to become president, but I can't. He saved my life. During Eisenhower's presidency, he had heart attacks and he had a stroke. Eisenhower knew he had problems, and he and Nixon arranged to make sure, one, that Nixon would always be briefed on major policy initiatives, that the transition, if Nixon ever had to step in, would be smooth and easy. And Nixon even presided over cabinet meetings when Eisenhower was sick. It was very clear what Eisenhower was trying to do, what Nixon was trying to do. It was a collaboration, a very public-spirited collaboration, to make sure that there would not be the same problem that poor Harry Truman had. When FDR died and Truman said, I felt as if all the moon and stars and planets fell in on me, because he wasn't ready. Eisenhower wanted Nixon to be ready, and Nixon wanted to be ready. Nixon also was Eisenhower's political operative, his water carrier. In fact, when McCarthy grew too big for his britches and started attacking members of the Eisenhower administration as being soft on communism, Nixon spearheaded the charge, the counterattack. And in fact, when a senator introduced a resolution of censure against McCarthy, Nixon appointed the investigative committee and appointed hanging judges. Nixon basically disposed of McCarthy for Eisenhower. Also, Eisenhower sent Nixon on various foreign trips. In one trip to South America, anti-American crowds nearly overturned Nixon's limousine, and he showed extraordinary courage. As Gary Wills wrote, the sad thing is, what people remember about it is that people spat on Nixon, not that he was brave and took it. You got to feel sorry for the guy in some ways. You really do. In 1960, Nixon was the Republican presidential nominee, facing a young, inexperienced Democratic senator, John F. Kennedy. Now, Nixon is an experienced vice president seeking to succeed a popular incumbent. He should have had the edge. Instead, his reputation for dishonesty hampered him. Certain political misjudgments he made, like trying to this is the first time the country had 50 states, so he's going to campaign in all 50 states, and exhausted himself in the process. And then, of course, there were the landmark televised debates with Jack Kennedy. Nixon had always distrusted television. I mean, he had reason. The Chequers speech was a humiliation for him. He didn't like it. But if you listened to the debates, Nixon wins. He sounds calm, measured, reasonable. Kennedy sounds young and shrill with that Massachusetts accent. And Nixon had one of the greatest speaking voices in modern American politics. It's a pleasure to listen to him, even when you can't stand him. But on TV, he looked nervous, haggard, and untrustworthy. The debates helped shift the momentum. Eisenhower did not give Nixon the full support that Nixon felt he deserved. For example, at one point, a reporter asked Eisenhower, "Can you remember a major initiative that was Nixon's idea?" And Ike said, "Well, if you give me a week, I might think of one." This does not help. As it is, Nixon lost by a relative eyelash. And there were rumors afterward of voter fraud in Texas and Illinois. And Nixon had to decide whether to contest the election or be a statesman. And he decided to be a statesman, but he always felt after that, I didn't win that election fair and I didn't lose that election fair and square. It was stolen. My foes will do anything to defeat me. He tried to revive his political career 2 years later by running against the governor of California, but he lost badly because everybody thought, no, he wants to run for president again. And he felt the press had treated him very badly. And he, unfortunately, at that point, the most famous thing Nixon ever said was this: "But think of what you'll be missing. You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference." Everybody said, that's it. It's his political obituary. Nixon went east to New York City. Now, in the 30s, when he had graduated from Duke Law School, he came up and made the rounds of every major New York law firm and was turned down because he was a hick from Whittier College and Duke Law School, as they saw it. He was not an elite guy with an elite law degree from an elite institution, namely Harvard. It's overrated. I went there. But in 1963, as a former vice president, everybody said, we want this guy. He was courted by every major law firm and joined a major, rather stodgy bonds trading law firm called Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, and Alexander, which became Nixon, Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, and Alexander and Mitchell, Mitchell being a guy named John Mitchell. He became what lawyers call a rainmaker partner, the guy who brings in the business and brings in the clients. He once excitedly telephoned a friend and said, "Someone asked me about what Charles de Gaulle will do, and I gave him a talk for half an hour and they paid me $10,000. And the friend said, "You dummy, you could have made $30,000. Nixon was stunned by how easily he could make money. But he still had the taste for politics. He tried behind the scenes to get back into it in '64, but the Republicans were too wedded to their flavor of the month, the then right-wing Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, who ran against Lyndon Johnson and lost in a landslide. In '66, though Nixon was telling everybody, "I'm out of politics, I'm done," he went to campaign for candidates for the House, the Senate, and governorships all across the country. And Republicans did very well that midterm election, and a lot of the credit went to Nixon. So in '68, Nixon said, "Okay, I'm going to try this again." He ran for the presidency. Republicans had it looked good for them. The Vietnam conflict was destroying Johnson's presidency, and the country was coming apart. Race riots, anti-war demonstrations, assassinations first of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and then of Senator Robert F. Kennedy. I was 12 years old. I thought the country was coming apart at the seams. I was terrified. We were all terrified, everybody. The American future seemed so perilous that Walter Lippmann, who was then the great pundit, nobody remembers him anymore. A couple of people remember him, okay. Lippmann said, "Look, America seems to require a politics of repression. If that's the case, I'm going to endorse Nixon, because if repression has to be done, he's the guy to do it." That's how scary it was. Nixon did not say, I'm going to be a repressive president. He defined himself as a moderate conservative between New York's liberal governor Nelson Rockefeller and California's right-wing governor Ronald Reagan. Nixon won the Republican nomination and presented himself as a new Nixon, who in private life had matured into a statesman. He promised to end the Vietnam War, in the process igniting a controversy over his secret plan to do so, a term he never used, by the way. He also promised a new toughness in the nation's war on crime, reform of federal-state relations to reduce the federal government's role, and I will revitalize the economy. What's odd is there's a great book called The Selling of the President in 1968 by a young journalist named Joe McGinnis. He never wrote anything as good after that. But in that book, McGinnis presents Nixon's campaign as the triumph of Madison Avenue advertising over political substance, and includes transcripts of all his campaign commercials. And nearly half a century later, I wish we had campaign commercials that substantive. It's a lot worse now. But Nixon was the first step on the road to what we're having now. One of the other things Nixon did was to run against an old political adversary. Remember, Earl Warren had the consolation prize of a Supreme Court nomination. Well, the first vacancy was the Chief Justiceship, and Warren made Eisenhower stick to his bargain. The Warren Court and the Warren Revolution in Constitutional Law transformed America, but lots of conservatives regarded Warren as an abomination. And Nixon, a very shrewd politician, argued, for example, I will appoint judges who will strengthen the country's peace forces as against their criminal forces. You remember that one. And I will argue for strict construction of the Constitution. Unspoken predicate, unlike what the Warren Court is doing. Nixon's drive for the presidency benefited from a couple of things. One, the Democrats, bitterly divided over the war, could not unite behind Hubert Humphrey. I know a lot of people in that era who actually sat out the election or voted for Nixon to punish the Democrats for Johnson and Humphrey. Nixon also devised something called the Southern Strategy. For the first time, Republicans would appeal to the Deep South, hinting at, well, you've been stigmatized as racist and this and that. We like you. We don't feel that way about you. We'll ease off a bit. We'll do things that will be in your interests. The Southern Strategy started to work. Even though a third-party candidate entered the race, Governor George Wallace of Alabama. Wallace was willing to say things that Nixon only hinted at. For example, if one of them hippies lies down in front of my limousine, that'll be the last limousine he lies down in front of. That was a red meat line for the audience. They loved that one. Or, I'm running against pointy-headed intellectuals who don't know how to park a bicycle straight. There was some worry in the Nixon camp that Wallace was going to carry the South and throw the election into the House of Representatives, and that's what Wallace wanted, because he wanted to be a kingmaker. He wanted to do a deal with whoever's going to be victorious so he could dictate the future of such things as race relations in the South. It didn't work out that way. Nixon edged Humphrey by just enough to capture an electoral vote majority and become president of the United States. So at 55, my age, Richard Nixon achieved his dream of becoming president. Now, few men were as well prepared for that office, as qualified to assume it, or as intelligent and intellectually curious as Nixon was. But few presidential aspirants had so divided the electorate. He was one of the most polarizing figures in our public life, much more so than Barack Obama or George W. Bush. Even though he struck a note of conciliation in his victory speech, he took office facing deep suspicion from nearly half the nation that he hoped to govern, and he knew it. And that knowledge was crucial to the course of his presidency. He inherited a presidency, and this is really important, that under pressure from crises foreign and domestic had grown in power for over 30 years. Now, as we know, presidents push their powers as far as they can, limited only by resistance offered by the other branches of government. That pattern of challenge and resistance reigned from George Washington up through the 1930s, the late 30s. Beginning really in World War II, you see a tendency to defer to the president in times of national urgency, and that tendency grows. A little bit under FDR, much more so under Truman, significantly under Eisenhower, then Kennedy, Johnson. Some scholars identify the invention of nuclear weapons and their terrifying power as spurring the growth of presidential power. Other commentators stress the development of communications technologies, which enable the president to define the national agenda, to create policy, and to speak as the voice of the United States. Further, the increased speed of events at home and abroad increased the need for a responsive federal government, whether to an economic slump, domestic unrest, or a foreign threat. And who gets to do that responding? The guy at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. These developments gave added weight to the arguments of those who, when the Constitution was framed and adopted in 1787-88, argued for vigorous executive power wielded by a one-man chief executive, the President of the United States. And yet, by the 1960s, the growth of presidential power outstripped even their expectations. Actual events like the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, and fiction, imaginings of the president as sole defender of the nation, like the novels Failsafe or 7 Days in May. There's a whole literature in this period. I call it the presidential crisis novel literature. The president's the hero. He's going to save us. All this taught the president had to have as much power as possible to guard against threats of whatever kind and from whatever source. The consequences for the president, this office is now looking almost like an elective monarchy. And it's supposedly, according to one presidential scholar, the late great Clinton Rossiter, in his book, The American Presidency, the presidency always ennobles the man in the office. Every president is made greater by becoming president. This is potential disaster. Lyndon Johnson had two famous press secretaries. Bill Moyer, as we all know. Before him, there's a guy named George Reedy, R-E-E-D-Y. He wrote a great book called The Twilight of the Presidency, which I urge you all to look up. Reedy was the first to argue that the president had become sealed in a bubble, isolated from ordinary experience. And that isolation created the risk that he and his advisors could see themselves as omniscient and omnipotent. And I'll just give you 2 sentences worth of Reedy. No one speaks to the president unless spoken to first. That's kingly. No one ever invites him to go soak your head when his demands become petulant and unreasonable. Now, a president so insulated could mistake his own preferences for the general good and his prejudices and insecurities for real threats to the nation. Now, into that office steps Richard Nixon, who prided himself on his grasp of foreign affairs and who brought with him the conviction that only the president, using information available only to him, could make the best calls on whether, when, and how to use his powers. Now, in this conviction, Nixon differed little from many of his predecessors like Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. Remember Johnson? At one point, he's visiting Vietnam, and he's walking toward the wrong helicopter, and an aide says, "Sir, your helicopter's over there." And Johnson says, "Son, they're all my helicopters." But Nixon goes beyond this. Nixon unites to his expertise and his intellect certain less salutary traits that the presidency's isolation and secrecy were destined to exacerbate. First, he wanted to be a world statesman like Winston Churchill, Woodrow Wilson, or Charles de Gaulle, all of whom were his heroes. Not a great group of heroes to have if you're looking to be modest, aware of your limitations. None of these men was aware of their limitations. Second, Nixon had a preference for secrecy and behind-the-scenes negotiations. He ultimately turns the presidency into a kind of black box, shielding policymaking from public view. The presidency produces little neatly packaged results, policies, as if pulling them out of a magician's hat. The public gets no real chance to see how policies are made or what factors policymakers considered or ignored. Feeding this was what John Ehrlichman, one of Nixon's advisors and a participant in and victim of Watergate, described as his penchant for intrigue. He loved intrigue. Third, politically, from the moment he took office, Nixon faced a Congress governed by the opposing party. That had not happened since Zachary Taylor in 1849. That was a source of frustration to Nixon, constantly. Although he did try to work with Congress, he also tried in 70 and again in 72 to carry Congress for the Republicans. And when that didn't work, he tried to work around Congress. He also had persistent, gnawing suspicion of his adversaries, whether in Congress, in the Democratic Party, in the federal bureaucracy, interest groups, or the news media. They're all working to frustrate my goals, impede my policies, and undermine me, so I will move against them first. To be fair, his worries about those ranged against him were not altogether creatures of his own brain. Liberal intellectuals, like my old mentor, Henry Steele Commager, could never see anything good coming from Nixon. Democrats couldn't see anything good coming from Nixon. Key figures in the news, everybody tended to view him with distaste. Exercises of presidential power they might have accepted or indeed welcomed from another president they didn't like from him. And this is a phenomenon we see today. From 2001 to 2009, Republicans love presidential power. From 2009 to the present, they hate it. From 2001 to 2009, Democrats love the filibuster, they want to preserve it. From 2009 on, they hate it. There's nobody who's a friend to the system. It's all your partisan perspective. Well, this is what's going on with Nixon and his adversaries. But this can be dangerous, especially the man who thinks, well, then I've got to go behind the scenes. I've got to go undercover. I've got to do things by end runs. He brought to his presidency two agendas, one public and the other covert. The public one, we will lower our voices. He wanted to promote a politics of conciliation and consensus. His covert agenda was to establish presidential authority over policymaking, whether by taking control of agencies in the executive branch or working around them. At first, for example, he planned to govern through his cabinet. Everything's going to be cabinet governance. These men, my cabinet, and I will govern the country. But over time, members of the cabinet started realizing, no, it's the White House that's governing the country. We're being left out. We're being forced out. The classic example, of course, was Nixon's first Secretary of State, William P. Rogers. Nobody remembers William Rogers. Who was Nixon's real Secretary of State? His national security advisor, a guy named Henry Kissinger, whom you all remember. The guy who looks like the guy from Dr. Strangelove. By the way, he was the basis for Dr. Strangelove. Stanley Kubrick followed him around at a White House cocktail party in the 60s, taking notes. But Nixon really wanted to be his own Secretary of State with Kissinger as his partner. Rogers was just pushed aside. Nixon saw the presidency as the nation's central political institution, as everybody did. By reorganizing the federal government and focusing decision-making within the White House, Nixon argued that he was bringing order and efficiency and neatness to public policy, and he was building on what earlier presidents had done. But again, there's another side, the partisan and personal basis, his visceral distrust of career officers in cabinet departments and administrative agencies. He was certain that they were loyal to liberalism and the Democratic Party rather than to him. He was convinced that they would try to undermine or derail his policy initiatives. He was determined to prevent them from crippling his presidency, whether they wanted to do that or not. The most agonizing problem he faced, of course, was Vietnam. And in retrospect, it's no surprise that he applied to Vietnam his penchants for secrecy, concentration of power, and suspicion of dissent. The president waged secret war in Indochina, beyond the actual ground action in Vietnam. He ordered secret bombing raids in Laos. He ordered incursions into Cambodia. Even as he insisted that he wanted to end the war, he did so by widening the scope of American military operations. pushing presidential war power as far as he could push it. He pursued a strategy to get peace, blending secret diplomacy and public negotiations with use of military power to coerce North Korea and North Korea's allies, the indigenous Viet Cong insurgency in the South. Now, the open face of Nixon's policy in Vietnam also included what he called Vietnamization. We will no longer do the fighting. We will have South Vietnamese military do the fighting for us and for themselves. And the problem was that the South Vietnamese government and military were too corrupt, fragile, and unpopular to maintain a united front against the Communist North and the Viet Cong. In '72, while he was campaigning for a second term, he continued his Vietnamization policy. But at the same time, between May and October, he ordered massive bombing raids on the North. And then in the weeks following his re-election, he stepped up those raids to coerce the North to the bargaining table. And it worked. In January '73, right around the time of his inauguration, the North and Nixon signed the Paris Peace Accords, which ended direct American military involvement in Vietnam and imposed a short-lived peace between North and South. It didn't fall apart until Ford's administration. When the North basically pushed, the South collapsed like a house of cards, and Vietnam was united under a communist government. Now, the Vietnam conflict spawned disputes between Congress and the presidency about war powers. Congress tried again and again to rein Nixon in. Ultimately, in '73, Congress enacted something called the War Powers Resolution, which I know you've all heard of. Nixon vetoed it, but Congress overrode his veto within a week. Now, as you know, the resolution requires the president to inform Congress within 48 hours of committing American forces to military action. It forbids the forces from remaining in place for more than 60 days, with a further 30-day period for withdrawal, unless Congress first authorizes use of military force or adopts a declaration of war. Now, the resolution's advocates insisted that this resolution was vital to rein in the imperial presidency. We have not had a declaration of war since 1941. How many wars have we engaged in the past 70 years? But Nixon and, footnote, all later presidents after Nixon reject the War Powers Resolution, charging that is unwise and maybe even unconstitutional. One example of a lesson we're still working on learning. Well, the Vietnam War, as you know, spawned a significant anti-war dissenting movement at home. And Nixon resented it and feared it. He took harsh measures against people in the administration who leaked their dissent to outsiders. He even ordered intelligence agencies to wiretap dissenting staff members of his National Security Council with the full connivance of his National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger. His running mate, Vice President Spiro Agnew, who he picked as part of his Southern strategy, attacked the news media for refusing to support the war effort. The nattering nabobs of negativism, an elite core of impudent snobs. These are Agnew's catchphrases. They actually did pressure the news media to tone it down, as the Nixon people saw it. In 1970, here's an example of how Nixon actually was tempted to push, or the Nixon people. Because remember what George Reedy said, it's not just the president in the bubble, it's the people around him. A young lawyer named Tom Charles Houston drew up a plan to coordinate American domestic intelligence agencies' efforts against anti-war activism and organizations and against dissident groups on the far left. Burglaries, warrantless domestic wiretapping, mail cover operations. Only the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, blocked this from happening. Not because Hoover was a friend of civil liberties, no, he was not, but because Hoover did not want to put his beloved FBI at risk. So Hoover went to Attorney General Mitchell and said, kill this. And Mitchell said, this is crazy, I'll kill it right now. That didn't mean that some of these ideas weren't going to be used later. They were. The thing that causes them to be revived is something called the Pentagon Papers, 40 years ago this summer. In 1966, I think, Then Defense Secretary Robert McNamara was feeling pangs of conscience about Vietnam, and he commissioned a group of Defense Department aides and people in places like the Rand Corporation to write a massive comprehensive history of American decision-making in Vietnam. The study filled 47 volumes. When it was done in 1967, McNamara immediately classified it. One of the authors of that study was a young Defense Department intellectual, Rand Corporation staffer, a former U.S. Marine and war veteran named Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg was consumed by guilt over the war that he had helped to bring about. Ellsberg decided, I have to do what I can to end this war. If I can expose the stupidity and bad judgment that led to this war, maybe that will stop it. He photocopies the study and leaks it to the New York Times, which starts publishing a series of articles, including extensive documents from the study, in June 1971. These articles exposed how administrations going back to Dwight Eisenhower, maybe even Harry Truman, had misled the American people about American involvement in Vietnam, and also how the decision-making was, to use my grandmother's word, vergacht, screwed up. We believe what we want to believe. We're not listening to what people are telling us from on the ground, because obviously they have an agenda, whereas we don't. We know better. No, they didn't. Obsessed with secrecy, Nixon, his Attorney General John Mitchell, and others in his administration, including Henry Kissinger, saw the reports leak as an unforgivable breach of national security. Nixon demanded the Times stop the articles and give back the papers. The Times refused. The government then sought to enjoin the New York Times to file an injunction to prevent a newspaper from publishing. Ellsberg then got in touch with the Washington Post. Okay, we'll enjoin the Washington Post. He went to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the Boston Globe. It happened over and over and over again. The case actually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, as you may know. New York Times v. United States and U.S. v. Washington Post. The court issued an opinion 6-3. Lifting the injunctions and allowing the study to go forward. 3 justices said, you can never enjoin like this. Prior restraint is a violation of the First Amendment by definition. 3 justices said, well, maybe in certain circumstances you could enjoin, but the government has not met its burden at all. 3 justices, 2 of them Nixon appointees, Warren Burger, Chief Justice Burger, the Ted Baxter of American constitutional history, for those of you who know the Mary Tyler Moore Show. He looks like a Chief Justice, but he's dumb as a box of rocks. Harry Blackmun, and one of the greatest Supreme Court justices on the right, John Marshall Harlan II, a truly great justice, all said, no, this is one of those rare times when prior restraint is justified. Nixon was furious, absolutely furious. And he was determined both to punish Ellsberg and those who helped him, and to make sure that no leaks like this would ever happen again. And this may be the first little pebble in the avalanche that brings down his presidency. Now, I don't have the time to go into all the stuff about Nixon's domestic initiatives. I will, as I said, I will email my lecture, and you'll have that. I'll just mention a very important revisionist book on Nixon by a historian named Joan Hoff, H-O-F-F, called Nixon Reconsidered. I think it sketches too favorable a picture of Nixon. I'm really torn, but it has some really interesting stuff on his domestic initiatives. One thing I'll say, he does good things. His administration pushes environmental policy. It creates the EPA, and it passes the Clean Air Act, which builds on and makes consistent a whole bunch of little laws passed before him. The Clean Water Act he vetoes because it's going to cost too much money. His veto is overridden. Then he tries impounding the funds, and there's a fight about when the president can impound funds or not. He tries welfare reform, and it doesn't work because of this weird coalition of left and right that don't like it. He helps create things like the NEA, the NEH. He does some remarkable things. And in some ways, he deserves credit for these, for their surface look. In other ways, Nixon's also doing certain of these things. Oh yes, I forgot the most important one, and the most popular one, revenue sharing. in which the federal government will simply give, with no strings attached, a portion of its tax revenues to state and local governments for them to spend as they wish. Now, there are two things that are going on with revenue sharing and some of these other measures like welfare reform. First, he really does want to change things. He really believes, for example, in devolving power from the feds to the states. The states are closer to the problem, they know how to solve it. But the second thing is, if he does this, he'll be doing an end run around those administrative agency and executive department Democratic bureaucrats who don't like him, and the members of House and Senate on the Democratic side who don't like him. He'll be cutting at their power. Because as he saw it, the old Democratic model of domestic policy both was designed to solve social problems and to empower people in Congress and to empower Democrats. Look, we're solving the problem, re-elect us. We can bring money to your district, re-elect us. Nixon's trying to work around it for political purposes. I'm going to skip over my discussion of Nixon and his Supreme Court appointees because it's just a mess. I'm just going to talk briefly about the unraveling of Nixon's presidency. It starts, as you know. Well, no, I'm going to back up. It doesn't start with Watergate. Victor Lasky, a very right-wing journalist, wrote a book called It Didn't Start with Watergate to let Nixon off the hook because he said others did it first. I'm just going to borrow his title while not quite agreeing with him, but to say it started with the Pentagon Papers, and it started with Ellsberg. Nixon and one of his White House aides, Charles Colson, organized an elite task force. We all know them as the plumbers. And why are they called the plumbers? Because they're going to plug leaks. Their first target is Daniel Ellsberg. They find Ellsberg's psychiatrist. They break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to try to find the notes of Ellsberg's therapy sessions to destroy Ellsberg in the public eye. They don't find them because the doctor doesn't believe in making notes of therapy sessions. They also try other things to plug leaks. This goes on and on. At the same time, Nixon starts organizing for his re-election campaign. He organizes a group outside the Republican National Committee called the Committee for the Re-election of the President. They called it CRP, the enemies called it CREEP, or CREEP. CREEP's a great acronym. I'm going to use CREEP. CREEP had a staff, and the staff was doing two things. One, an incredibly aggressive fundraising campaign. Incredibly aggressive. Bordering, as one of its targets, George Steinbrenner, the late unlamented George Steinbrenner of the New York Yankees, bordering on extortion. If you don't give lots of money to Nixon's re-election campaign, the government will actually look at certain aspects of your business for tax purposes, for antitrust purposes, so give the money. The other part of it is Nixon's facing an array of potential opponents. Can we knock the stronger ones out so he can face the weakest possible opponent? One example, a leak claiming that Mrs. Edmund Muskie, the wife of Senator Edmund Muskie of Maine, Humphrey's 68 running mate and the front runner in 72, had used the word Canucks to refer to voters of French-Canadian descent in New Hampshire. New Hampshire, the primary state. This is before the Iowa caucuses ever existed. Muskie goes to New Hampshire to confront, this is not true, my wife's a good woman, and then he breaks down and cries. He's so upset by these attacks on his wife. And what the charge didn't do, the tears did. Nixon's people succeeded better than they knew. Over and over again, dirty tricks. Classic bad dirty tricks like in bad college frat hazing, like ordering 20 pizzas and sending them to the Humphrey organization. We didn't order these pizzas. Well, they said you did. Things like that. Stupid things. But gradually they worked. And so Nixon's opponent ended up being, in the eyes of Nixon and the country, as it turned out, the weakest possible opponent, George McGovern. Nixon and the people at CREEP were also worried about what the Democrats had in store for him. If you're paranoid, you're convinced your enemies are out to get you. This may be the reason for the most famous burglary in American history, the Watergate break-in. They may have been looking to see what the Democrats had on Nixon. Did they have something connecting Nixon or Nixon's rather corrupt and shabby brother to Howard Hughes and Hughes Tool Company? Was there something about ITT, International Telegraph and Telephone, which was supposedly providing money under the table to finance the Republican National Convention? Who knows? All we know is they did a bad job. A security guard named Frank Wills noticed that a doorway had been taped, took the tape off, saw it was put back an hour later, and called the cops. The cops came and busted 5 men, all in business suits with rubber gloves. One of them was James McCord, a former CIA operative and head of security for CREEP. The other 4 were people whom McCord had worked with during the Bay of Pigs invasion in '61, all anti-Castro Cubans, who, when they were questioned before the judge and asked what their occupations were, they said, "Patriot." Great. 2 young reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, no relation, were assigned to the story. There is no evidence at all, that Nixon had advanced knowledge of any of this. Basically, if you remember the story of Henry II and Thomas Becket, King Henry II, Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton, Henry II says, "Who will rid me of this cowardly priest? He's just angry." And these guys, these knights say, "We'll do it," and they do it. I think in many ways what happened was Nixon's suspicion and paranoia fueled the doings of people like E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, said, "Yeah, we'll do it for you. We'll do it." So Nixon didn't know before these things were happening, but when he found out that they were happening, his first instinct was cover up. And that, in a nutshell, is what brings him down. It's the cover up. That's true of every later major Gesundheit presidential scandal. It's not the actual scandal, it's the cover-up. If you cover it up, you make it look 10 times worse. The story broke after the election. Keep in mind, Nixon won with 60% of the popular vote and 521 out of 535 electoral votes. He only lost Massachusetts and D.C. His grumpy response was, "Yeah, but I didn't carry Congress. They'll say I'm a failure because I didn't carry Congress." Think about the insecurity of the man and the paranoia that he was plagued with. He couldn't enjoy the greatest electoral vote majority in American history since James Monroe, who won with all but 1 electoral vote, and one guy voted for John Quincy Adams because only George Washington should be elected by everybody. But in the spring of '73, the cover-up starts to come unraveled. James McCord feels that he's been screwed. He writes a letter to the judge, the chief judge of the District of Columbia, the U.S. District Court, John Sirica, saying hush money was paid, perjury was countenanced, this was corrupt. Sirica hits the ceiling. Sirica is an old-line right-wing Republican judge appointed by Dwight Eisenhower. Sirica is a hero in the history of the American court system. He says, "I want to get to the bottom of this." He impanels a federal grand jury. In Congress, in the Senate specifically, the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, chaired by Sam Ervin, with his right hand, the Republican Howard Baker. Howard Baker's staff lawyer is a young lawyer named Fred Thompson, who later had a movie and political career. I hate to say this, but Thompson's service in the Watergate Committee was his best career move. And then Nixon announces, "I will appoint my White House counsel, John W. Dean III, and he will conduct an investigation that will root out corruption and clear the presidency." By the end of April '73, this is not what happens. A wide-spanning web of criminal activity with links to the Nixon White House is exposed. Nixon's forced to accept resignations by his chief of staff, H.R. Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, and Attorney General Richard Kleindienst, who had become entangled in the cover-up. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, and Dean are indicted for their parts in the Watergate cover-up. Mitchell had gone to the committee to re-elect the president, and that's how he got tangled in. Dean gets fired. Dean turns state's witness and becomes the key witness before the Senate Presidential Committee. Dean reveals that Nixon and his aides had prepared an enemies list of politicians, journalists, and celebrities, and they were planning, and I'm quoting, to screw their political enemies, using the full powers of the federal government to do so. Dean added that in one of his last meetings with Nixon, he tried to warn Nixon, a cancer is growing on the presidency. And he implied that Nixon was indeed implicated in the cover-up and might have committed the felony of obstruction of justice. Nixon has to appoint a new Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, who pledges a full investigation. He will name a special prosecutor. He names a special prosecutor, my old constitutional law professor, Archie Cox. Nixon's furious because Cox is an old Kennedy guy. But Cox was an honorable and decent man, I can tell you that. During that summer, the Senate committee accidentally discovers that Nixon was taping his meetings in the White House. And the focus now shifts. If Howard Baker's question is, what did the president know and when did he know it, the tapes probably will tell us. Nixon then pleads what? Executive privilege, right. And the litigation begins. Nixon tries to order Cox not to demand the tapes. Cox refuses the demand. Nixon tries to work out a compromise with the Senate. Cox rejects the compromise. Nixon orders his Attorney General to fire Cox. Richardson refuses and resigns. Nixon orders the second guy, William Ruckelshaus. Ruckelshaus resigns. Finally, the acting AG, the Solicitor General, one Robert Bork, says someone's got to obey a presidential order. He fires Cox. The country goes mad. Gradually, as you know, things go up the ladder, the federal judicial pyramid. Bork appoints a new special prosecutor, a tough Texas litigator named Leon Jaworski, who had voted for Nixon twice, by the way, in 68 and 72. And the case ultimately produces an impeachment inquiry and a U.S. Supreme Court decision. These two things start pressuring Nixon to realize he can't hold it. He can't keep his presidency. In the summer of 74, the House Judiciary Committee, amazing hearings, you can find this stuff on YouTube, votes to recommend 3 resolutions of impeachment. The U.S. Supreme Court rejects Nixon's claim of executive privilege. He has to turn over the tapes. Transcripts won't do. Nixon releases a transcript that no one had ever seen before, the so-called smoking gun transcript, proving that he and his aides had conspired to get the CIA to tell the FBI, lay off, this is a national security matter, obstruction of justice. On the first impeachment resolution, 10 Republicans had dissented. Overnight, they switched their votes because of that revelation. Finally, on August 7th, Nixon meets with 3 senior Republican legislators, Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona, Hugh Scott, senator from Pennsylvania, Republican minority leader, and John Rhodes, Republican of Arizona, the House minority leader. And they tell him, you're doomed. You're doomed. You will be impeached by the House. You will be convicted by the Senate. Nixon asks Goldwater, what kind of vote will I get? You won't get more than 10 to 12 votes in the Senate. And Nixon says to Goldwater, how will you vote? And Goldwater says, I'm leaning that way myself. The next day, despite his promises to the cabinet, Nixon announces to the country that because he has lost his political base, he must resign the presidency. Within a month of his resignation, President Gerald R. Ford pardons him. To spare the country, as Ford says, and I believe him in retrospect, the ordeal of perpetuating the Watergate mess and maybe risking Nixon actually dying in the middle of the trial because he had already nearly died from phlebitis. And there were rumors that he was suicidal. Who needs that? I just want to read you 2 things Nixon said about Watergate. This is what he said when he accepted the pardon. No words can describe the depth of my regret and pain at the anguish my mistakes over Watergate have caused the nation and the presidency, a nation I so deeply love and an institution I so greatly respect. I know that many fair-minded people believe that my motivations and actions in the Watergate affair were intentionally self-serving and illegal. I now understand how my own mistakes and misjudgments have contributed to that belief and seem to support it. He couldn't admit it. That he couldn't go that last mile. This burden is the heaviest one of all to bear. That the way I tried to deal with Watergate was the wrong way is a burden I shall bear for every day of the life that is left to me. But he said something else. He said something else. There. One thing he said to David Frost, I gave him a sword, and they stuck it in and they twisted it with relish. And I guess if I'd been in their position, I'd have done the same thing. I let down my friends. I let down the country. I let down our system of government and the dreams of all those young people that ought to get into government but now think it too corrupt. Yep, I let the American people down, and I have to carry that burden with me the rest of my life. That's as close as an apology as we would ever get from him. But we got something else from him, which in a way is an extraordinarily insightful understanding of what he did to destroy himself. The last sentence of his speech to his staff before he boarded the helicopter and left the White House. Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself. One last thing that I'll say. The lesson that we should learn, or the lessons that we should learn, are these. Yes, other presidents had abused their powers before Nixon. None so sweepingly or so consistently as Nixon. Others have abused their powers since Nixon, which meant that his resignation did not end the problem. We have to look at the presidency in the constitutional system. We have to restore what we used to have. 3 coordinate branches, all tough, all vigilant to safeguard their prerogatives and powers, all willing to tug and haul and resist one another. This does not mean taking the political or constitutional system hostage, but it means tough-minded politics. And if you and your students want to see what it looks like, go back and look at the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. He didn't get his way all the time. He had a tough fight with Congress, and he knew how to fight, and they knew how to fight. And the same with the court. The one time when Roosevelt screwed up is when he thought he had this gigantic mandate to override both Congress and the court, and that's when he got his ears pinned back. But in many ways, it is an extraordinary tragedy, a tragedy, I submit to you again, of Shakespearean proportions, that Richard Nixon's presidency failed. But the failure was not a conspiracy by evil liberal elites to bring down a good man. The failure was a failure by a man whose suspicion and paranoia overcame the capacity for greatness within him, and worked with the tendencies to feed presidential omniscience and omnipotence to destroy the President of the United States. I want to say one last thing. Nixon and Jefferson together. I owe them both a lot. I owe Jefferson a lot because my book has done very well, and I hear from some of you that you've already started and like it. Nixon got me into this field. I was a high school kid when Pentagon Papers happened, when Watergate happened. I was a college freshman when Watergate came to its culmination. That gave me the fascination for constitutional history that has fed me from that day to this, and that I've tried to share with you today. To use Ford's word, nightmare. Or the late, great journalist J. Anthony Lucas, who wrote a great book on the underside of the Nixon years called Nightmare. Most people regard nightmares as unreal, traumatic experiences that are best forgotten. And that's how many Americans have treated Nixon and Watergate. I think the lessons that we should have learned and should still learn are in danger of dissolving into limbo. The leading example is the imperial presidency. You remember, that's a bad term. A presidency that is reaching past its constitutional bounds for powers it should not have. Okay, it was controversial during Nixon's era. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote the book, The Imperial Presidency, and right after Nixon's era, but it has faded from view. We now hear about the unitary chief executive. Has anyone heard this phrase here? The unitary chief executive. It's a theory of presidential power advanced by such people as former Vice President Dick Cheney and the law professor John Yoo, who used to serve in Bush II's White House and Justice Department. And it traces its arguments to one sentence, the first sentence of Article 2, Section 1. The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States. Now, Article 1 says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States. Cheney, Yoo, and their allies argue that that sentence, the executive power shall be vested, means that the president gets a whole bunch of executive power. Everything that George III had at the height of his powers, everything. He can make war. He can make peace. They dismiss all the contrary evidence from the Constitution's origins. Further, they pass over the dire consequences that such a presidency could have for the constitutional system. Watergate made those consequences evident. And some of you may remember, whether from the movie Frost-Nixon or from the actual David Frost interviews with Nixon in '77, the key one on Watergate, the last one, when Frost says, but this happened, this illegal thing happened, and this illegal thing happened. And Nixon says, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. Just saying it, my blood runs cold. Just saying it, hearing it. Nixon's presidency is an unnerving illustration of the cliched truth, and we all know that cliches start as truths, that we should not forget the past lest we be condemned to repeat it. And it sheds a bleak light also on uncritical veneration of the presidency by citizens, politicians, and scholars, which occurred for decades preceding Nixon's election. So let's begin by looking at who Nixon was. Before the presidency, okay? Okay, let me, before I get into the other president that we're going to be talking about today, I'd like to talk a little bit, just a little bit more about Jefferson in particular and the founding guys in general. You'll notice I'm not calling them the Founding Fathers. That's the Warren Burger term. I think of it as the Warren Burger term, although in writing my more recent book, The Founding Fathers Reconsidered, I discovered something I didn't know, and I'll bet you guys don't know this either. Who coined the phrase Founding Fathers? Would anyone care to take a guess? I'll give you a hint. It does not come into existence until nearly a century after they're dead. Someone said Charles Beard, and that's the right time frame. Warren Gamaliel Harding. Warren Harding coined the phrase in his keynote speech, the Republican National Convention in 1916, kept using it until he finally puts it into effect for good in his inaugural address in 1921. I don't like the phrase. It's too reverent. It's too worshipful. It's too uncritical. I mean, we have to, what I say in my book is, instead of gazing reverently up at the founding guys or looking down our noses at them, we ought to meet them eye to eye. Because they were human, as we are. And that they had human strengths and human frailties, as we do. They were able sometimes to transcend their era, but they were also prisoners of their era, as we are. And so when I hear people like a certain modern political movement, and I don't want to get political on you, I am saying this only as a scholar and historian, when I hear people saying, we are true to the ideals and vision of the Founding Fathers, I say, no, you're not. You don't have a freaking clue. You don't get these guys. They didn't all agree on anything. The founding guys argued with one another constantly. What we have is not a product of their let us join hands together because we all agree. No, they almost never had a moment like that. It was usually, let us compose our differences. Let us, as Ben Franklin said at the end of the Federal Convention, let us doubt a little of our own infallibility. Let us compromise. Compromise. The founding guys compromised regularly. Sometimes the compromises were great and made a great deal of sense, like the creation of issues I can't really get to today: pornography, civil rights, and of course the agonizing issue of abortion. Roe v. Wade was decided during his presidency, and the main opinion for the court in Roe v. Wade was written by an appointee of his, Justice Harry Blackmun. Nixon brought to boiling point a cauldron of constitutional problems that afflicted the American system then and are still troubling to this day. Now, why? We have a vague sense of Nixon, unless we're specialists in this period, or specialists in the history of the Constitution. Why is that? Because a lot of the time we make the mistake of thinking that the issues are peculiar to his presidency and peculiar to him. And let's face it, with respect to the dead, he was a peculiar guy. He was extraordinarily uncomfortable in conventional small talk settings. He's the kind of guy who would walk on the beach wearing a jacket and tie and ordinary classic shoes, not sneakers or whatever. I mean, Nixon, someone once said Nixon looked as if he was born at the age of 42. He's a peculiar man. He's endlessly fascinating. I think, in some ways, he is Shakespearean. Somewhere, the ghost of William Shakespeare is just eating his metaphorical liver, saying, I never got to write about him. I never got to write about him. Peter Morgan, our Shakespeare, who does amazing historical movies, like Frost Nixon, captured Nixon brilliantly, with the help of a truly great actor, Frank Langella. Now, you remember Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford, who we have habitually and unfairly underrated. I think in retrospect, Ford's star is going to rise like you wouldn't believe, that he really was a remarkable president. But you remember his first speech as president. My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Footnote, that last phrase is from the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights, drafted in part by John Adams. Have to plug John Adams. Ford was acknowledging that under Nixon, the system had not worked, triggering a long national nightmare. And he suggested that Nixon's departure ended that nightmare, restoring the constitutional system to working order. Ford meant well, and I think in many ways, as president, he really tried to restore the constitutional system to working order. But what he took as a conclusion, I think, remains an open question, because later controversies over presidential power and presidential misconduct suggest that the issues we saw dramatized in Nixon's era are still with us. They were not resolved by Watergate. But the American people have treated the Nixon era as they would treat any of Congress. One house represents the people and is apportioned by population. The other house represents the states, and each state has an equal voice, 2 votes. That's a good, sensible compromise. Are there compromises like the compromises over slavery? Are classic examples of political hostage-taking. We will break up this convention unless you agree to certain protections for our peculiar institution. Bad compromise. That could never happen again, now could it? Gee, maybe it did. Be that as it may, they're human like us. to set them up as some timeless standard of political wisdom is not only kind of silly, it goes against what they themselves expected. They expected us to move beyond them. They expected us to make advances on their knowledge. We hear it from Jefferson. We hear it from John Adams. We hear it from James Madison. We hear it from all the founding guys. They engaged in a creative argument between past and present about the future. They expected us to do the same. I think sometimes when you hear politicians, left or right, say, we are being true to the founding guys and you should back us because we're being true to the founding guys, without kind of referencing the inherent political wisdom of what they're saying, they're selling you a bill of goods. Another problem, the founding guys did not have a clue about what society was going to be like 2 centuries and more after they were here. They could not imagine a Supreme Court with 3 female members and 1 African American member. They could not imagine a black president. They could not imagine a Supreme Court, by the way, with 6 Catholics and 3 Jews, shalom, shalom, and no Protestants. This is extraordinary. They could not imagine Asian Americans in Congress. They could not imagine any of this stuff. Just one further example before I move on. The question I've gotten many times, what would the founding guys have made of September 11th? My response is they would have had a collective nervous breakdown. First of all, New York, 8 million people, when the United States in 1790 was 3.5 million? Holy crap. Second, you show them a picture of the World Trade Center, 110 stories tall. I'm trying to find it. I found a letter once where Adams describes when he's in Paris, John Adams, going up to the top of a building 6 stories tall, looking down and getting a violent headache. Jefferson talks about climbing onto the Natural Bridge and looking down 270 feet and getting a violent headache. That's in Notes on Virginia. You can find that easily. Jefferson is the great architect among them, who said, how do you make a building that tall stand up? He had no idea what reinforced steel interior construction was. Then you show him airplanes. Oh yeah, we knew you'd get flying machines. But then you tell him, look at this picture of an airplane. The fuel tanks of this airplane have more destructive power than the entire Royal Army and Navy combined. They go nuts again. Then you show them the video of that horrible day. And this is what really sends them to Bellevue. I'm serious. The whole world saw it happen in real time as it happened. Whether you lived in Charlottesville or Braintree or London or Paris or Riyadh or Jerusalem or Melbourne or Sydney or Tokyo or Beijing or Nairobi, wherever you were seeing it as it happened. These men were used to having to wait months for news from across the Atlantic. Maybe 6 months to a year from news from the other side of the world. Even a week to 10 days for news, if they were in Charlottesville, news from Boston. They wouldn't begin to comprehend the world of September 11th, let alone the event. And one last example. How many of you used to watch Star Trek? I love Star Trek. Okay, what is your opinion of the Vulcan-Rigel War of 2295? You have no idea, do you? Because you have no idea that there are civilizations on Vulcan or Rigel, let alone that they're going to go to war in 2295. To ask you that question is as stupid as asking what the founding guys would make of September 11th. It's stupid. It makes no sense. But as we are learning to our cost, the American political system's capacity to generate stupid questions seems to be without limit. Now let's turn instead to a really, really intelligent yet incredibly flawed president. I asked before how many of you, and a surprisingly large number, reassuringly large for me, said, yes, I remember Richard Nixon when he was president. The theme of what I want to talk about with you guys today is this. Richard Nixon's presidency was a unique ordeal, a constitutional ordeal for himself and for the nation. He and his administration repeatedly collided with the Constitution over and over again on issues like presidential war powers, freedom versus secrecy, separation of powers, checks and balances, criminal justice,